Hi, how are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on. How are you?
I'm pretty good. So, what's sacred about a cheesecake and why?
Well, a cheesecake is delicious. That we can all agree on.
Hmm.
That's granted. But a cheesecake also represents something which is seen typically as mundane, as ordinary, as quotidian. But the idea behind that, perhaps a bit clickbaity title and thumbnail, was that the everyday and the normal, what we take for granted, when we stop and pay attention to it, is actually full of awe and wonder and can really capture us. And there's something sacred about that. The ability for a normal thing, when we stop and pay attention and we bring our perception to a standstill with that otherwise very ordinary object, that can become an object of sacrality for us. And the idea behind that video was about learning to slow down and to take what we take for granted and to really pay so much attention to it, and in doing that to see the divinity, to see the power, to see the rapture that even an ordinary thing like a cheesecake can capture us with.
So, would you say awareness is the key thing?
I think awareness is a good word. I think there are many words that are used sort of interchangeably in this context. There's awareness, there's consciousness, perception, and I think all these words basically are variations on a similar thing. And it's about the idea is that we go through life pretty much not paying too much attention to what's going on around us, because there's so much stimuli and so much data that our senses are taking in, that if we actually paid attention to all of it all the time, we would just be totally, we wouldn't be able to function as human beings. And what happens from the neuroscientific perspective is that the brain actually functions, at least according to many theorists, the brain functions as a limiting valve to hold back the overload of sensory input that would otherwise render us useless. But what happens in a moment of rapture, a moment of unity, a moment of intimacy, and a moment of spiritual or religious experience is that we allow ourselves to take ourselves out of that ordinary running of life, where we're running just like a sleeping machine, to use terms from Gurdjieff, to who was the machine metaphor, will come back to me, and to allow ourselves to return to being fully human in the present experience. And we do that in a time and space where the the evolutionary needs for survival that created this limiting capacity in the brain are no longer necessarily needed in that moment, and we're in a safe space where we can open ourselves up to the awe and totality of being of the universe. And it's in those moments where we can experience that phenomenon. And I think this phenomenon is actually, it's not ironically, it's not mystical or spiritual or supernatural. It's a very normal thing, and it's very experiential, and it's well documented. And that's perhaps what's interesting about it.
Although, to me, I would say that the mystical is actually real anyway. We've just been
Yes,
taught to believe that it's all woo woo, right?
yes.
But
So I agree. So the way that me and you would use that word, working and studying in a field of mysticism, would be correct to say that it is a mystical, a unitive experience. And what I meant to say was it's not a woo-woo experience. It's not mysticism. It's not mystical in the way that people think mystical means.
so, what's the difference between mysticism and this kind of unity experience?
So I think that part of mysticism is this form of perception, is a mystical unit of perception. The way I understand mysticism is by breaking it down into three interrelated categories, which is experience, theory, and practice. And the experience is where this is what we're talking about takes place. And the experience, I think, can be broken up further into experience of nullification and unification, where there's annihilation of self and then there's the expansion of self, perhaps. And we can get more into the specifics of the experience. Then there's the theory of mysticism, which is the theology, the metaphysics, the sciences, the cosmology that try and give us a framework of what a world based on that experience looks like. And then there's the practice, which is both the techniques and methodologies to try and bring that experience back, to try and really make space for that experience, and the practices, which are the ethical practices going forward, how one lives their lives in accordance with these experiences and theories. So to me, mysticism is the totality of that package, and therefore the mystical experience would just be the beginning of that chain.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense actually. Yeah, thanks for clarifying.
Yeah, my pleasure.
So, what's your upbringing and how did it lead you to mysticism?
Yeah, I was raised in a Orthodox Jewish Hasidic family. Hasidism is one of the contemporary forms of Jewish orthodoxy. And the Hasidic movement, in its institutions and in its foundation and by its theology, is a mystical school. It's in many ways a brainchild of the better known Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. And essentially what Hasidut or Hasidism did was to take Kabbalah and make it available to the masses. And in some senses, without getting into technicalities and to indulge in a bit of cliches here, Hasidut psychologizes Kabbalah. And so I grew up studying Jewish mysticism before I even knew that such a word mysticism existed. I mean, mysticism is an English academic use, was the only form. I wasn't exposed to other forms of Judaism or other forms of religion. And when I was about 16 and in the thick of my Chabad Hasidic Orthodox Jewish education, I perchance came across a book. It was actually a Dan Brown novel, which it's a bit embarrassing how popular of a book it was. It wasn't Da Vinci Code. It was a less popular one. So there's a bit
Angels
of
and Demons
in that fact. No, it was Lost Symbol.
Okay.
And in the Lost Symbol, he dives into an idea based essentially on Christian classic biblical mysticism, the idea that the human can become one with God. The human can lose their own ego and sense of separation and become one with all there is, and that's an act of deification, of apotheosis, of henosis, depending on what it's called in various
so it's
traditions.
Gnosticism.
And it, to me, firstly, well, it was a Gnostic. So the idea of a theosis or henosis or apotheosis does find a strong role in Gnosticism, but it's also quite present in early Christian mysticism, both what later becomes the Western Church Fathers, and also in the very, very present in the Eastern early Church Fathers, Maximus the Confessor, and others, and Gregory of Nyssa, and but it's an idea actually which I think is found beyond just Christian mysticism. I think it's an idea which is expressed in any mysticism which blurs and blends theism and mysticism. So you may not see this in perhaps Buddhism, which is any mysticism really which has an idea of God, but also has an idea of unity at its core, because mysticisms, almost by definition, are monistic. There has to be a point where the human can either transcend, or by embracing their humanity can become divine. And that's very much the core of mystical, religious, theistic mystical theologies.
So it sounds kind of contradictory, but it's not, right? You embrace your humanity, you become divine. You embrace your divinity, you become fully human.
Yeah. So the idea of fully human, fully divine, which becomes a strong term later in Christian theology, but only about one person in specific, was used, I think, more correctly by earlier Christian theologians and others to describe all of reality, that every human is fully human, fully divine,
right?
And not just humans, all existence. So Gnosticism has its own sort of blend and its own particular mythologies and narratives, and the focus there is on knowing the true nature of one's being, and by that knowledge one is redeemed, which is what Gnosticism. It's what gnosis means. Gnosis means know, to know thyself, know that you are the divine. So I discovered that there was mysticism in other traditions. I discovered Christian mysticism, and that really blew my mind for two reasons. Firstly, these ideas that I was studying in the morning in like my own very, very sheltered sectarian community, to think that there were other traditions out there, traditions which I had grown up by an extension of Jewish history, that I saw as antagonistic, as enemies, as people that hated us. To see that they were teaching a core truth which was so close to home, firstly, that was crazy, and secondly, it allowed me to begin to reconceptualize my own categories in different ways. There's this line from Aldous Huxley in the beginning of his great work, The Perennial Philosophy, and he which is an anthology of this perennialistic idea, which is another book which was very influential when I read it later. And he says that he intentionally does not quote passages that are familiar to people, because the familiarity breeds a numbness. If an idea is repeated to someone so many times, the ability for that idea to shock the person and to really wake them out of their reverie is lost. So for me, I think hearing these ideas from an outsider in a different language, in a different tongue, in a different context, allowed me to stop and say, whoa, what did I just hear? What did they just say? And then to be able to look back at my own religious upbringing and education and be like, whoa, what are the ideas that I'm being taught? And fundamental, yeah, and that really set me off on my journey to explore the unity and universality of mysticism, to see this idea of non-duality, of the omnipresence of the divine in all of us and in everything, as really the core truth of religion, and a really powerful message for our generation.
Right. Well, absolutely. And so it's a sort of diversity of thought and a unity among them. And I guess it's like you realize that you're right, what you're taught isn't special, but it's part of something, a unity that's even more special.
Exactly. Yeah. So I don't think so. I think that seeing the globality or the universality of something does not make it any less special. For
Right.
me, that could be a concern. That could be a danger that people have. That if people see that there's something that's beyond just my tradition, then there's something that's uniquely lost. And for me, that did not happen. For me, seeing that this idea was universal only made it more special, and only made it more real and more persuasive and more convincing and more understandable to me. And 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 also, an important point to make is that when we recognize the universality of something, it's not to erase the differences, because I think that differences are beautiful, and I think that we can embrace distinction inside unity. We can embrace diversity within unity, but it has to be done within the umbrella of unity, because distinctions and
Right.
difference on their own lead nowhere. They lead to divisiveness and animosity and hatred. But if we can have a framework of unity, of oneness, and then within that, what used to really excite me for many years was seeing the points of unity between traditions, and that blew my mind. And going down to nitty gritty levels and getting like these deep, like metaphysical, cosmological, psychological truths being shared across traditions that never spoke to one another. But that became so commonplace that it was then discovering the differences and the minute differences between them, which became so titillating and so fascinating and so telling, more than the unity were, which is,
Oh, really?
yes, yeah, which is a fascinating thing in and of itself.
All right. So, what are the most notable distinctions between similar ideas of different religions?
Yeah, that's a great question. The first thing that's coming to mind is to really begin at the top. And I think the way that we conceptualize the divine is very, very fascinating, because God is really by definition, is the highest category of thought that we humans have. And therefore, when you ask someone, what's your God concept, you're really asking them, what is the nature of your entire hierarchy of concepts? What's the nature of your entire chain of being? Even if those ideas are lost on people, because we live in a world which is very, post metaphysical and post Neoplatonic, and all of those systems that supported those hierarchies, still it's a very fascinating and telling question. And I think what perhaps is the most interesting is that when you look to certain mystical traditions, they will speak about the divine as the true isness, the true being.
Hmm.
So in Islam, for example, I'll give you a few examples. In Sufism, which is the dominant form of Islamic mysticism, we talk about God as wujud, which is beingness, being itself. And obviously, it's a being which is unified. So there's this idea of wahdat al-wujud, the unified being. In Kabbalah, for example, in Jewish mysticism, we'll talk about God as the yesh ha'amiti, the true being, almost a parallel term. In Christian mysticism, someone like Meister Eckhart, a middle-aged, very, very influential Christian mystic, talks about God as the ground of being, as the very foundation of being itself. And that's one formulation which you see more perhaps in the West. Um, and I'm going to say something here, and then I'm going to quantify it in case people that are listening are going to like start throwing rocks at me. In the East, what you see in contradistinction to these Western ideas of God as beingness, as the totality of being, you see God identified with nothingness. You see this in Taoism, you see this in Buddhism, where there's an emptiness, a shunyata, and that's how God is seen. So is God the full isness, the full saturation and presence and power of being, or is God complete emptiness and complete silence, complete stillness? And I think that's a very fascinating distinction. And the qualification which I'm going to add in here is that in both traditions, you see both formulations as well. So, for example, in Jewish mysticism, we'll still speak about God as ayin, as the ultimate nothingness with a capital N, the no thingness, because God is no thing. In Meister Eckhart as well, he'll talk about God as being no object. There's no thing. The nisht, the nothing, which is God in the German. But I think that's just one fascinating distinction that comes to mind, where do we see divinity in a full concrete presence, or do we see divinity in absence and silence? Do we try to tune into the silence of the universe or to the music of the cosmos?
Well, certainly both are common themes of all these traditions. So if you were to ask people in those traditions, I guess the answer is both. And even if you look at more contemporary, more modern mysticism, that, like, for example, the law of one, there's this idea of the infinite creator being nothingness, but also being everything.
Yes.
So
Yeah.
fundamentally, they're two sides of the same coin, right?
I agree with you. So I think they are two sides of the same coin, and I think they're not the totality of being and the totality of nothingness are not other than one another. They're really united. There's a very interesting idea in many fields, in logic and metaphysics, where the ends meet up. So you can see difference and plurality on the spectrum. When you come to the end, it's a circle and it comes back together. There's an idea in the Zohar says that no, it's actually the Sefer Yetzirah, another Kabbalistic book, says no, it's tchilatan b'sofan v'sofan b'tchilatan. Like the beginning is wedged in the end, and the end is wedged in the beginning, like the Ouroboros that swallows its own tail.
Oh, there's an episode of Rick and Morty. This is actually about it. It's about something like the Time Master or something, and they were in this train set that's going round and round and round, and they're moving to different carriages. It's on the third series, I think. Have you seen it?
I think, Nicholas, we're gonna have to pause this interview. We're gonna have to go watch it and come back and continue.
I'll tell you what. Well, I don't think we will now, but if you
No,
want to get a reference, you can find that episode. It's pretty
we'll have to,
interesting.
we'll have to bring on the whole audience to watch it with us. There may be some trademark issues if we do that, but yeah, no. So that idea of the circle, which is embedded in itself, which really means that the all and the nothing. See, it's very hard for us humans to comprehend, because we live in a world of which is filled with the relative, with the subjective, with the non-absolute. So we see things in a state of differentiation. This is what the Kabbalists call Helem. It's what the Eastern mystics called Maya, and where there's a sense that the world that we inhabit is in some ways reflections of the absolute, but reflections which don't capture the full intensity of the absolute. So we therefore see a reality which is made up of differentiation, of distinction, of degrees, of. But if we were able to, like using the metaphor of Plato's cave in the Republic, if we were able to leave the cave and stare at the sun, we would see how all of these things are really
Right.
encapsulated and unified in the totality, and we would see how everythingness and nothingness are really the same thing.
Is this related to the holographic principle?
Yeah, so the holographic principle, the principle that all is in all, that everything is in everything else, is seeing reality from a true perspective, seeing how nothing is separate, and nothing is just a fragment of reality, but every fragment contains the whole. And this sort of that pattern continues for all eternity, where the fragments in the fragments in the fragments contain the all, right?
And that also sounds like Hermeticism.
Yeah, so what I think is so fascinating is that I think these ideas, once you sort of launch yourself into the heart of the metaphysics of mysticism, and you begin talking, you begin pulling references from 100 different wisdom traditions and philosophers and sages and mystics and prophets from throughout the ages, because these ideas, I think, are basic to the structure of the human mind and reality.
Right.
And when you dive into them, you're going to start seeing Hermetic references and Gnostic references and Christian references and American Indian references and Shinto and Baha'i and you just open up the floodgates, and what happens is you hear how all of the traditions, whereas when they looked from the outside, they look like they're all heavily disagreeing, and they kind of have a word in commonality with one another. The theologians are all quibbling from today until tomorrow. As soon as you switch and look on the inside, and you allow the mystics to speak, you hear how the mystics speak really in one voice. And what emerges is this incredible harmony, and each voice enriches the other. When we can bring in an idea, a Hermetic principle, let's say as above, so below, where we can bring in a Gnostic principle, we can bring in a Buddhist, a Taoist, a Hindu principle to bear on our lives in unison with one another, it creates the most complete map of reality that religion can possibly conjure, because no religion on itself can give us the entire map of reality. But when we begin to map in the pieces and create this grand puzzle of reality from all of these religious traditions, it seems like we're building the map of reality, and a map that not just shows us where we are, but also where we want to be.
Right. Do you think Carl Jung's work is so powerful because he draws upon the unity of ideas in religion?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. So I think Carl Jung's work and his students, most particularly, I think for a generation was Joseph Campbell, and now for new generations been Jordan Peterson, who I think believe is continuing that lineage of thought, is so powerful because because people live in a world which ordinarily is so ruptured and so broken and so fragmented and so torn, and so it's so hard to find agreement on anything, right? We live where politics is all about debating and screaming louder than one another, where there's really no cohesive narrative and message and I mean, in a day when religion was dominant, religion told us how things was, and the church gave you this is how reality is, this is how you get to God, this is what you got to do, and you follow that. But in a day and age today, with the advantages and the challenges of modernism and secularism and the scientific revolution, the industrial revolution, we live in a new world where there is no more compelling grand narrative. And I think people both lost faith in grand narratives and became very scared of grand narratives when they saw how the world just went to absolute bloodshed over grand narratives with World War I and World War II.
Yeah.
And I think what Jung and many other thinkers along with him, I would put William James, Aldous Huxley, and others in his corner. They were trying to come back to a world which had both lost any meta narrative and had both been disabused of meta narratives by the tragedy of totalitarianism which they gave birth to, and tried to and said, let us try and scrape back into the debris of the past, and let us try and conjure up a narrative that we lost, that we so badly need, but a narrative that is going to give people hope and courage and love and inspiration, instead of a narrative. Because essentially, I mean, what, to take Nazi Germany as an example, they gave people a grand narrative which was fundamentally divisive and hateful. It divided the world into very essentialistic races, and there were races who were superior and inferior, and it
Yeah.
gave people real sense of there is an order in this world, and there's an order which we can execute and act on and move the world to a better place with it. But it was terribly, terribly, terribly misheaded and ended up in the deaths of millions, and the enormity of the tragedy is one which no one even needs to explain today. And what Jung was able to do was Jung was able to say, we can still go and try and build up a grand narrative based on the foundation of rigorous thought, of being critically thinking and being compassionate and loving, and finding a way to take this. And I see my work actually in that continuation. I was very, very enamored, not so much either by Jung or by Peterson, but by Campbell, who was the intermediary
Oh,
character. And Campbell's work is someone who I like swallowed whole as a
what
child.
could you tell us about Campbell's?
Yeah. So Campbell is well known for his idea of the hero's myth, or the monomyth, where he was the leading mythologist of his generation. Very, very popular for many books that he wrote that sold very well, and a TV show that he did together with Bill Moyers, called The Power of Myth, which is all like available online. And what Campbell did was Campbell went scouring. I mean, the man was an absolute genius, and he had read like just about every mythology that humans had ever recorded. Like, just an insane, just a brilliant mind. And he had gone and collected all of the mythologies and began to look for the shared points of narrative that they all had in common. And he devised what became known as the hero's myth, or the hero with 1,000 faces. And there's probably a diagram which you're familiar with, where the hero begins in their hometown. There's a call to action, and they meet their guru. They reject the call, and then there's sometimes a second call. Then they go into the underworld, which is like the second. If it's set on a 12-hour clock, they go into the underworld, which is like past 3. And then at like 4, they encounter a minor challenge. At 6, they encounter like the dragon, or the beast, the monster. There's usually sometimes there's a death and rebirth. They encounter the father. I don't know the exact specifics. I could be messing up the numbers, but the basic idea is, and then they return at 9 o'clock. They return into the world, and they basically bring the gifts back to their hometown, and that's the hero's myth. And the hero's myth was basically showing how there's a fundamental story that humans have told and do tell for all of history, and that story is a story which sustains us, a story which gives us purpose and meaning and direction, which we can follow, and we can embark on our own hero's journey. And that hero's journey actually played a big role in very, very popular films of our own generation. And not by chance, the people who made the Lucas brothers, I think, who made the Star Wars series, consulted with Campbell to make sure that their narrative was mythologically accurate and therefore had an element of enduring truth to it. And you see the same story being retold again in contemporary narratives, which is something which Jordan Peterson has got quite good at pointing out and explaining. And there's the basic argument is that these stories are told in traditions that have no contact with one another because there's a fundamental archetypal truth to them. There's something in the human experience which is yearning for a hero's journey, which wants to take on a role of a savior, which wants to be a messiah to their own people, to their own town, to their own community, country, and world. And what Campbell did was Campbell gave a generation of people that were absolutely lost a way to follow their journey with greater and lesser degrees of success. Campbell famously told people to follow your bliss, follow your stars, using a common mythological myth. And he later regretted that. He said that he should have told people, instead of following your bliss, to follow your blisters, that sometimes it's the challenges in life that lead us to where we need to be. And so there's a challenge in taking these ideas from the academic world and bringing them into a way that they can really influence everyday people in the real world. And Campbell had a large degree of success with that. But that's essentially the project that he was embarking on, and a project which I see myself in many ways in continuation with.
Right. So a major thing I've seen you talk about is the Kabbalah, right?
Yeah.
And there's this tree of life that's really
Yes.
interesting to see, this really interesting image of things.
Yes.
So could you go into that and explaining essentially what is it about to someone who doesn't know?
Yeah. So I'll try explain what the tree of life is on one foot, which is quite an ask, but I'll see what I can do.